Well, I'm so grateful, first of all, to Julia for those very kind and words, and especially to the Costan family for making this all possible, and to Georgetown University and Georgetown's Department of Theology, and to all of you for coming, because it gives me the opportunity once again to talk about things that are very close to my heart and things that I really spend much of my time working on, thinking about, writing, and trying to communicate. So with that said, we'll launch into this topic. It sounds a little bit dense and a little bit difficult, but I'm going to hope to try to make it as clear and accessible as I can, because difficult as these terms, incomprehensibility, infinity, etc., are, they are central to the message of the Christian mystics, and I think also to the mystics of other traditions. The problem I want to investigate is how it is possible to have an encounter with God as long as we conceive of the divine as beyond all human thought and experience. In other words, is all that the great mystics have written about finding God in their lives a kind of self-delusion, because they claim that God is infinite, incomprehensible, and therefore unknown, and yet insist that God has in some way entered their lives? I will not try to give a general answer to this difficult question, but I think there is value in looking at it in terms of the origins of Christian mysticism, specifically through the lens of the teaching of the early Christian mystics about divine infinity and incomprehensibility. We will not deal much with autobiographical testimony. The early Christian mystics said little about themselves and their own experiences, but we will deal with their insights into the witnesses to direct consciousness of God found in the Bible, which for the early mystics is always, in a certain sense, their inspiration, their paradigms of what might be possible in their own lives. Since the time of the Jewish philosopher mystic Philo in the 1st century, Moses had been the archetype of biblical mysticism. In the late 4th century, the Christian Gregory of Nyssa, the last of the Cappadocian fathers who formed the Orthodox synthesis, wrote a treatise on the life of Moses, in which he gave an account of Moses the mystic. Explaining the 33rd chapter of Exodus, where God tells Moses, "You cannot see my face, for no one shall see me and live," Gregory comments, he, Moses, learns from what was said that the divine is by its very nature infinite, enclosed by no boundary. It is not the nature of what is unenclosed to be able to be grasped. But every desire for the good which is attracted to the ascent of that mountain constantly expands as one progresses in pressing on to the good. Never to reach satiety in desiring is truly to see God. This paradoxical not seeing that is still a form of seeing reflects Gregory's teaching that because God is infinite, the divine nature must be incomprehensible or unattainable, or better, attained only by a non-ending pursuit, a stretching out forever, for which Gregory coined a term, apektasis, Greek term, that is the existence or position, the stasis, that is directed towards, epi is the Greek pronoun, epi, directed towards the infinite unknowable God, and that also takes one out of oneself, again the Greek ek, so apektasis. So it means taking a place where you are taken out of yourself and directed towards God. Gregory rooted this teaching in Paul, especially in Philippians 3:13, in which Paul speaks of forgetting what lies behind and stretching myself out to what lies ahead. The same fusion of yearning and satiety characterizes the other major mystical prototype of the Old Testament, the Bride of the Song of Songs. In the first of his homilies on the Song of Songs, Gregory refers to both Moses and to the bride of the song as she asks for the kiss of the mouth, that's Song of Songs 1:1, and he notes and says, "So it is with all others in whom the desire for God is deeply embedded. They never cease to desire, but every enjoyment of God, they turn into the kindling of a still more intense desire. Both Moses entering into the darkness on Sinai and the bride of the song searching for her divine lover on her bed at night, Song of Songs 3, are key figures in the development of the mysticism of darkness and unknowing, what the French sometimes call la mystique nocturne, night mysticism, you might say. The connection of divine infinity and incomprehensibility with the endless pursuit that is at the same time perfect satiety forms one of the fundamental themes of Christian mystical theology. Revisiting the origins of this development is a way of reflecting on its significance. And I will pursue these issues in terms of three interrelated questions. First, when did God become incomprehensible? Second, how did God become infinite? And third, how is it possible for finite humans to undertake an infinite pursuit of God? I'll do this in three sections. First, some background in Greek philosophy and also in Philo. Secondly, Christian thinkers between about 100 and 300 CE. And then I'll close with a shorter section dealing with 300 to about 500, specifically Gregory of Nyssa and Pseudo-Dionysius. So that's where we're kind of going in these three parts. Conceiving of loving assent to the first principle as the goal of human life was not something found just in Judaism and Christianity, but was known to some Greek philosophers, especially Plato. Plato's Republic and Symposium give ample evidence for the importance of the soul's search for permanent possession of the good, the one, the beautiful, a possession that both beatifies and divinizes. But what kind of supreme principle did Plato have in mind? For Plato, Aristotle, and most of the ancient Greek thinkers, it was form, eidos in Greek, that was the proper object of thought. Something that was undetermined or formless, without boundaries or infinite, was defective, a kind of surd for philosophical study. Despite their negative attitude then towards infinity, Greek philosophers did discuss it. For Plato, the absolute form of the good that is beyond being, as he says in the Republic, might be above our powers of knowing and describing, but he generally does not speak of it as formless or infinite. It's only in his Parmenides, the treatise which investigates the logical and what some would say metaphysical meaning of talk about the one as the highest principle, tohen, the one, that Plato was prepared to say, and I quote, "The one, therefore, is unlimited, without beginning and end." It was left to Plato's interpreters to try to determine what he meant by this. Now, Aristotle was willing to admit potential infinity, that is, an infinite succession in motion or time, but he was opposed to any actual infinity, that is, a state or reality that had no limits in the here and now. It was only gradually that later Greek philosophers came to realize that the supremacy of the first principle, if it's truly beyond everything that we can know or conceive, has to be without limits. It has to be infinite. In the 3rd century of the Common Era, the father of Neoplatonism, Plotinus, did indeed speak about infinity and unboundedness in a variety of ways, negatively with regard to matter, more positively, if in a qualified way, of intelligible beings, and at times, and this is what's central to Plotinus and my theme, he even ascribes an unqualified sense of infinity to the highest principle, the principle that he called the one, following Plato's Parmenides. As he put it in Ennead 6:9, and I'm quoting, "And the one must be understood as infinite, not because its size and number cannot be measured or counted," that's Aristotle's view, "but because its power cannot be comprehended." Thus, Plotinus insists that although it is difficult to make sense of something that is without form, this is what one must do if one is going to philosophize about the one. Intellect, second major principle, studies what has shape in terms of being, but the one is formless, being therefore before all form, before movement, before rest. In making contact with the one, Plotinus appeals to what we can call mystical consciousness. For example, when he says, "Our awareness of the one is not by reasoned knowledge or by intellectual perception, but by way of a presence superior to knowledge." The gradual recognition by Greek philosophers of the infinity of the first principle was a lengthy development. Less contested was the notion of the ultimate source as incomprehensible and ineffable. This trajectory had a long history in ancient philosophical speculation. In the Timaeus, for example, Plato had said, to discover the maker and father of the universe would be a task, and therefore, having discovered him, to declare him to everyone would be something impossible. This is a text often cited by later Christian authors, but it signifies only a relative incomprehensibility and ineffability. Other texts went further, not only in what has been called subjective negativity or apophaticism, that is, saying that the supreme principle is beyond our ways of knowing and describing, but also in claiming that the supreme principle is incomprehensible in itself, per se, what has been called objective apophaticism. In the Parmenides, Plato said that the one is outside time and being, so that the one has no name, nor is there any description or knowledge or perception or opinion of it. And it is neither named nor described nor thought nor known, nor does any existing thing perceive it. This was the basis for Plotinus's insistence that we can only say what the one is not what it is. Plato, therefore, can be called the grandfather of negative or apophatic theology, although the technical vocabulary of this language about God, such as the use of words beginning with the Greek alpha privative, and the claim that the only way to know the highest is by not knowing, is not explicit in his writings. That treatise of Plato's, however, the Parmenides, was the main source for the development of traditions of negative theology among later Platonists, such as the so-called Middle Platonists and then the Neoplatonism initiated by Plotinus in the 3rd century. Now this history can't be taken up here, but it is important to note one key figure often spoken of as a Middle Platonist, and that is Philo, contemporary of St. Paul probably. Philo was the first thinker to use Greek philosophy as a tool for investigating biblical revelation, and on this basis created a theory of mysticism that had a lasting effect on the Christian fathers. So if Plato's one beyond being gave rise to one trajectory of negative theology, Philo's witnessed to a transcendentalizing of what the Greek philosophers called the existent one, the existent thing, to on, and what he, under the influence of the book of Exodus, called he who is, hoon, can be said to be the source of another negative trajectory, one in which a supreme existence is there but is unknowable. I'll quote you one passage, Philo. He says, "Do not suppose that the existent which truly exists is apprehended by any man. It follows that not even a proper name can be given to the truly existent. The attributes Philo ascribes to God as he who is," that's Exodus 3:14, of course, often begin with this alpha privative. He speaks of him as unnameable, that's akonomastos, or ineffable, arestos, uncircumscribable, incomprehensible, unqualified, etc. Although this language is deeply philosophical, Philo was anxious to show that his teaching was rooted in biblical passages expressing God's unlikeness to created things, especially the texts about not naming God, think of Exodus 6:3, or not being able to see God, Exodus 33. But among the negative attributes used of he who is, Philo does not describe God as unlimited or infinite, the Greek aperon. He uses that term 60 or 65 times in his many writings, but he always uses it in the Aristotelian sense of an infinity of numbers or an infinity of space, etc., never of the actual infinity of the highest principle. Now, the time allowed for this lecture precludes any attempt to sketch even the broad outlines of negative and apophatic theology in the early centuries. Any adequate consideration would have to take into account not only the thought of Middle Platonist philosophers like Numenius, but also the complex world of texts and traditions usually called Gnostic today for want of a better term. Some scholars have argued that it was in some of these Gnostic texts, especially from the Sethian Gnostic treatises such as the Foreigner, the Allogenes, that a fully developed apophatic or negative mystical theology first appeared. Many of these Gnostic texts were produced by and for individuals and communities who thought of themselves as followers of Christ, and some were read by later Christians, as we can see from the 4th century Nag Hammadi library. Nevertheless, the role of these Gnostic texts in the main Orthodox mystical tradition was not central. And so I'm going to turn here to the Christian developments in the second part, the early Christian developments, concentrating on Clement of Alexandria and Origen, before moving at the end to Gregory and to Dionysius. The story of the Christian development of this complex of infinity, incomprehensibility, apektasis, begins with the Bible. The early Christian mystics used Greek philosophy to help them understand and explain the message of the Bible, not vice versa. The technical language of negative theology, apophaticism, is absent from Scripture. But the notion of the hidden God who cannot be seen, perhaps not even known, is present. In the Old Testament, there's some disagreement about whether God can be seen by humans in this life. Some texts, Genesis 33 and the story of Jacob or Isaiah 6:5, seem to say, well, yeah, you can see God. Other texts suggest God always remains invisible. Again, Exodus 33. A number of passages speak about God's hiddenness. Isaiah 45:1, truly you are a God who hides himself, O God of Israel. Other texts emphasize divine transcendence without using technical philosophical language. Again, Isaiah 55:9. For as high as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, my thoughts than your thoughts. God's invisibility and transcendence are given great emphasis in the New Testament. According to the Johannine prologue, John 1:18, no one has ever seen God. It is God, the only Son, who has made him known. Or 1 Timothy 6:16, God dwells in unapproachable light, whom no one has ever seen or can see. We also have the famous passage in the 17th chapter of Acts, where Paul finds an altar on the Areopagus at Athens that's dedicated to an unknown God, agnosto theou, and it promptly then he launches into the sermon identifying this God with the God who made the world and everything in it. He who is Lord of heaven and earth, who does not live in shrines made by human hands. And Paul obviously thinks of this as an unknown God. So, given this biblical foundation, it's no surprise that Christian thinkers from the beginning adhered to what I call a soft apophaticism. Soft apophaticism. That is a teaching that God as Father and Creator is beyond all human knowing and seeing, but his saving love has been manifested in the life and death of Jesus of Nazareth, now raised from the dead and manifested as Lord and Savior. Although ascended into heaven, Christ is present in his church through the action of the Spirit dwelling in the hearts of the faithful. Christian theologians have always admitted that, I think, Christian theologians of any stripe. In the 2nd and 3rd centuries, however, this general, soft, if you will, negative theology began to take on new depth in the teachings of Christians in Alexandria who are conversant with Greek philosophical religion and the Greek philosophers, going back to Plato, and also had read Philo. And this was the beginning of a systematic hard apophaticism, as I call it, that was to culminate in Gregory of Nyssa in the 4th century and then in the Dionysian writings in the 5th century. So that's where we're going with this scamper through the centuries. And I'll start with Clement of Alexandria, who I think has a central place and is often overlooked. Clement of Alexandria, whose dates are roughly 150 to 215, was the first major apophatic theologian in the Christian tradition. Clement was a penetrating but a kind of unsystematic thinker. His miscellanies, his stromates, miscellanies, carpets, collection, etc., they're a collection of observations and essays that have fascinated and puzzled interpreters who tried to present something like a Clementine position. This Alexandrian thinker defended the supremacy of what he called the barbarian wisdom of the scriptures, founded on faith, over the learned wisdom of the Greeks. But he tried to combine Christian teaching and the best thinkers, such as Plato, because he was convinced that some philosophers, at least, had had contact with the Logos. His teaching on the beliefs and practices of the best Christians, the true Gnostics, as he called them, was created in opposition to the false Gnostics. The false Gnostics who held that the created world was the product of an evil God, and that the souls of those few who were to be saved were naturally akin to the higher invisible God. Hence, Clement stressed the doctrine of creation, the importance of faith as the foundation for true knowledge of God, and the place of Jesus as revealer and redeemer. In expounding his views, Clement incorporated a wide range of the themes and vocabulary of Hellenic philosophy. Along with Plato and others, he viewed the goal of human striving as a vision of God, the vision of God, theoria theou in Greek, for which he, like later mystics, found a biblical proof text in Matthew 5:8. Blessed are the pure of heart, for they shall see God. Along with this word theoria, contemplation, contemplatio in Latin, he uses it about 80 times, Clement introduced many other significant terms into Christian mystical discourse, such as the adjective mystikos itself, hidden, especially with regard to the hidden meaning of the Bible. He uses it some 50 times. Or the term divinization, theosis. He was even willing to speak of becoming united with God, a language which he could cite Paul and John in favor of. So Clement, in a sense, is the father, in some ways, of Christian mystical discourse. Clement also reflected deeply on the limits of speaking about God. Book 5, chapters 9 through 13 of his Stromates, his collection of texts, is a mini treatise on negative theology, the first in the history of Christian thought. In these chapters, Clement makes use of the negative terminology found in Plato, the later Platonic tradition, and Philo, as well as many of the apophatic texts from the Old and New Testaments. His two favorite biblical sources were the story of Moses in Exodus and the letters of Paul, especially Paul's texts on the mysterion, the mystery, the hidden secret plan of God revealed in the incarnate Word. I'm going to do a brief survey of this first treatise on apophaticism in the history of Christian mysticism. Clement begins chapter 9 of Book 5 by noting how the best Greek thinkers divided their followers into two groups, the lower hearers and the higher disciples, a teaching which he also finds in Paul. Other sources from both the Old Testament and the Greeks underline the importance of the instruction that's given to the advanced group, which is a true illumination by which the fullness of Christ, I'm quoting here, the fullness of Christ, according to the revelation of the mystery sealed in the ages of eternity, is now manifested in the prophetic scriptures. That's Paul, Romans 6, 25 to 26. This Christological foundation leads to the first of 7 explicit passages on negative theology in the treatise. First one reflects on letters from Plato. Plato's letter 2, it's probably ascribed to Plato, not actually by him, and he quotes the letter. For the God of the universe, who is above all speech, all thought, all conception, can never be the object of a written teaching, being ineffable in his power. Again, Clement finds confirmation for Plato in Paul, noting that the milk and meat that Paul speaks of in 1 Corinthians 3 is the milk of catechetical instruction and the meat of inspective contemplation, inspective contemplation, which is the flesh and blood of the Word, that is, the seizure of the divine being and the divine powers. Quoting Psalm 33, taste and see that the Lord is good, Clement says, to eat and drink the divine logos, we attain knowledge of the divine essence. Now, we can wonder what kind of knowledge this essential grasp of the divine essence is, so Clement launches into a discussion of the means of attaining and the limits of knowledge of God in the next chapters, chapters 11 and 12. Chapter 12 discusses the soul's ascent to God by means of what he calls abstraction or separation, beginning with abstraction from the body and its passions, because God is so different from material things. It says when the Bible uses anthropomorphic descriptions, material descriptions of God, these names have only allegorical significance. Clement then returns to the distinction between the minor mysteries of instruction and purification and the great mysteries, between the hearers and the advanced. The great mysteries which lead to contemplate and comprehend nature and created things. The lower mode of purification, it's attained through confession of sin, confession of the Christian belief. The higher mode is the contemplative, or what he calls apophatic mode. And this comes about through analysis, the analysis by which we abstract first from physical qualities, then from depth, breadth, and length, finally even from the point or the monad. Clement concludes this difficult passage by saying, being lifted up above all the attributes of bodies and what one calls the incorporeals, we launch ourselves into the greatness of Christ, and from there advance ourselves through holiness toward the abyss, and we approach in some way to the understanding of the all-powerful, knowing not what he is, but what he is not. Not what he is, but what he is not. Here I think we reach a key moment in the evolution of Christian negative theology. That is the claim that God is best known by not knowing. It's the Greek term agnosia, later on used by Dionysius. This, I argue, is a more negative position than what Philo had allowed. Philo knew that God is absolute being, although he said we cannot know God's essence. Clement would agree that we must say that God is being in a superlative sense, but he goes further by saying we know God best by not knowing, without specifying that God really is pure existence or anything else. Note that Clement also insists that whatever the Greeks knew of the limits of our knowledge of God, it is only through Christ that such unknown knowing becomes real and effective. And he reinforces this by turning to Moses in Exodus 33 again. Moses asked God to manifest himself, knowing full well that God can only be grasped by the power that comes from God himself, so that, and I quote again, the grace of the knowledge comes from God through the Son. Now, the 12th chapter of this 5th book contains 4 passages on negative theology in the midst of a discursive analysis filled with numerous quotations from Greek philosophers and Greek poets. Clement starts by citing a text from Timaeus 28c about how difficult it is to know the Creator, and he claims that Plato took this account from Moses entering the divine darkness in Exodus 20. Clement advances his case by citing another of the premier texts in the history of Christian mysticism, Paul's account of being wrapped up to the third heaven where he heard unutterable words, 2 Corinthians 12:4. And this leads Clement on to the most extensive discussion of negative theology in the treatise. He begins once again with Scripture, citing John 1:18 about only the only begotten Son who is in the Father's bosom is able to declare the hidden and unknowable Father. Calling, and quoting Clement here, calling the bosom the invisible and ineffable character of God, and for that reason naming God as the abyss, insofar as he envelops and contains all things in his bosom and is thus himself inaccessible and without limit. Without limit. This is the first entry of the language of limitlessness or infinity into the treatise, and Clement speaks of God as infinite about 19 or 20 times across his various writings. So, discourse about God is difficult to understand because such discourse is beyond genus and difference, species, individual, and number. Clement's conclusion goes beyond what we've seen in Philo and is a new stage, I think, in the history of biblical speculation on divine unknowability. And I'll quote here a passage at somewhat greater length. He says, "One does not correctly call God the all, because the all belongs to the order of greatness, and God is the Father of the totality of beings. Nor are any parts to be predicated of God, because the one is indivisible and for that reason infinite. Not in the sense of an extension that is impossible to traverse, that's Aristotle's view of infinity, but in the sense that where he is without distinction and without limit, he is also consequently without shape and without name." Nothing better illustrates the difference between Clement's hard epiphaticism and Philo's weaker version than what Clement says next. Turning to the positive names of God, the cataphatic names of God, Clement says that it is only improperly that we call God one, good, intellect, being itself, Father, God, Creator, Lord, and the like. None of these terms, taken separately, he says, can designate God, although the whole group can serve to indicate the power of the Creator, the Pantocrator, because predicates are expressed either by means of the properties to which they are attached or by their mutual relations. But one can take nothing from this procedure in relation to God. So these terms are useful for us, but inadequate really in relationship to God and himself. Therefore, Clement concludes that there is no demonstrative science about God, no episteme apodectike. Clement's placing his notion of the transcendent, infinite, unknown God within the context of the message of the Scriptures was a key move for later Christian mysticism. His teaching here was further enriched by other forms of language found in this treatise and elsewhere in his writings, especially the language of beyond and above, which he uses in relationship to God. These terms function as kind of forerunners to the use of some of the language later found in Dionysius. For example, in Stromates 5:11, Clement says that the first cause is not in a place, but is above place, above time, above name, above intellection. In Book 2 of the Stromates, he declares that God is beyond space, beyond time, beyond anything belonging to creatures. For Clement, the God who is known by not knowing is the saving God. His power to rescue humanity from sin is only disclosed by the grace given through Jesus Christ. He says it remains that it is by divine grace and through the Logos alone who comes from God that we are able to conceive of the unknown God. One Clement scholar says the God beyond, that's the unknown Father, is found through the God within, that is the Logos. Or as Clement put it in the text I cited previously, in order to know God, we must be launched into the grandeur of Christ. That's a wonderful phrase when you think about it. We have to be launched into the grandeur of Christ. Now, Clement's apophatic theology contains many of the elements developed, deepened, and more systematically expressed by his successors, but one looks in vain in his thought for any erotic yearning, intense desire for the unknown God. And this is where Origen comes in. Origen took a different tack from Clement. Clement used Scripture extensively in his treatises. Origen devoted his entire life to engagement with the Bible from the level of textual exegesis through hundreds of homilies explaining the application of the text to everyday life to the long commentaries intended for the advanced Gnostic believers. Origen also wrote a treatise on first principles, the De Principiis, containing the first attempt at a systematic presentation of Christian belief, as well as a theory of exegesis in Book 4. Origen, however, was no apophatic or negative theologian. To be sure, he uses some soft apophatic expressions, such as saying that God is incomprehensible, an incomprehensibility due to the limitations of the human mind in the face of God the Father, who he identifies with absolute existence, the supreme good. On this basis, Origen rebutted the claims of the pagan opponent of Christianity, Celsus, about the indescribability and namelessness of God by saying that it is possible to see and name God, because we can come to know the maker and father of the universe by looking at the image of the invisible God that's found in Jesus Christ. Hence, according to Origen, positive attributes like goodness and being do signify the pure form of the divine nature, although in a way that is beyond our full comprehension. Significantly, therefore, Origen does not speak about God as being infinite, which to him means formless, negatively incomprehensible. At the beginning of chapter 9 of book 2 of his De Principiis, he says, if the divine power were infinite, of necessity it could not even understand itself, since the infinite is by its nature incomprehensible. So despite his rejection of apophaticism, two aspects of Origen's thought played an important role in the intellectual development that I'm trying to sketch. The first one is negative, and the second is more positive. On the negative side, Origen's theory of the double creation implied a limitation in God that was later to become one of the prime accusations against him and the reason for the condemnation of his thought. For Origen, the existence of evil in the world could not be the result of an all-good God. So he postulated a prior spiritual world of pure intellects, created good and equal, after the pattern of the true image of God, the true image of the Father, the Logos. United to God in perfect contemplation as these spirits were, God gave them freedom and hence the possibility of falling away. Origen speculates that due to sloth and weariness, as well as reaching a certain state of satiety in contemplation, these supernal intellects began a process of withdrawal from God, who then created a second world, the world of our existence, as a kind of cosmic schoolhouse in which angels, humans, and even devils exist on different levels of materiality to help them gradually learn how to return to God. Yes, even perhaps the demons. Origen's view of this universal return, or apokatastasis as it's called, was controversial, not least in implying the possibility of the salvation of the devil, as well as an endless cycle of falling away and returning. So that's the negative side, where the tradition turned against Origen. The double creation was condemned. On the positive side, however, we need to note Origen's theology as ascent, his Theologia Ascendens, which understood the soul's mystical rising up to God according to the divine pedagogy set out in Solomon's 3 books. Origen explains this in the prologue to his commentary on the Song of Songs. So Solomon wrote 3 books. These 3 books are the perfect postgraduate education. Proverbs represents moral science, ethica, virtual living. Ecclesiastes teaches natural science, physica, that is, how the things of the world are to be used in finding God. The highest science, which Origen calls epoptica, contemplative or mystical science, instructs the soul on how to come to dogmatic and mystical matters and to rise to contemplation of divinity with pure spiritual love. This is what is taught in the Song of Songs. Now, Clement never cited the Song of Songs. It was Origen who put this text at the center of Christian mystical discourse precisely because its language revealed the yearning eros, the yearning love, desire that drives the soul on in its pursuit of the divine lover. As he put it in the prologue to his commentary on the song, the power of love is none other than that which leads the soul from earth to the lofty heights of heaven, and the highest beatitude can only be attained under the stimulus of love's desire. The human soul, however, possesses eros, yearning, not from itself, but as a participation in God's creative eros, In the same prologue, Origen writes, "Whatever is written in the Bible about charity, agape, should be taken as also said about yearning love, eros, taking no notice of the difference in terms because the same power is shown in both words." So although Origen's erotic God has his limits, because he's not infinite, the Alexandrian's evocation of the dynamism of eros throughout his works, but especially in the Song of Songs commentary, adds the element that will complete the theme of incomprehensibility, infinity, epectasis, endless yearning that is both satisfied and in its very satisfaction always eager for more. And this leads me to the two final thinkers that I want to mention, Gregory of Nyssa and then Dionysius. It was the achievement of Gregory of Nyssa to pull all these elements together. The theological context of the Cappadocians helps explain Gregory's breakthrough. Although they were deeply influenced by Origen and also Philo, the Cappadocians found that Origen's limited notion of God, as well as his subordination of the Son to the Father, gave weapons to the Arians, and especially the Neo-Arians of their time, who set forth a view of God as both limited and comprehensible to humans. One of the surviving fragments of the teaching of the Neo-Arian Bishop Eunomius goes so far as to say, and I quote, "God does not know anything more about his essence than we do, nor is that essence better known to him than to us. Rather, whatever we ourselves know about it is exactly what he knows." Cappadocians didn't like that. To counteract such claims, the Cappadocians advanced a hard apophatic view of God's infinity and incomprehensibility. You can see that in John Chrysostom's sermons on the divine incomprehensibility. But it was Gregory of Nyssa who combined this doctrinal apophaticism with a mystical program, as we see it in his life of Moses, his homilies on the Song of Songs, his sermons on the Beatitudes. Gregory learned much from Origen, as well as from Clement and Philo, but he went further. His view of divine infinity has been well studied, so I'm not going to try to lay it out here. I wish only to return briefly to my opening remarks to show how Gregory fused what I'm calling the hard apophaticism that he used against the Arians with a dynamic view of yearning eros, and eros never satiated, but also never without satisfaction. Following Philo and Clement, Gregory saw Moses' life found in Exodus as the model for mystical progress to God. His life of Moses is not a verse-by-verse exegesis, but it rearranges the Moses story in its second part. This section is organized around three theophanies, three manifestations of God, each with a Christological component. The first theophany is the burning bush, Exodus 3, which reveals that the best positive name for God is the really real, so that the transcendent essence and cause of the universe in which everything depends alone subsists. This is the positive, the cataphatic moment. Second manifestation is the ascent of Mount Sinai described in Exodus 20, where Moses encounters God in the cloud and darkness, indicating the priority of negative theology, a seeing that is a not seeing. But there's more. The final theophany is Moses' conversation with God in Exodus 33. Here, Moses asks for a vision of God's face, but told to stand in a place in the rock, which Gregory equates with Christ, Moses is only allowed to see God's back as God passes by. Picking up on the erotic yearning of the bride of the Song of Songs, Gregory says, "Such an experience seems to me to belong to the soul which loves what is beautiful. In his never-ending ascent to God, what Moses yearned for, he says, is satisfied by the very things which leave his desire unsatisfied. He learns from what God said that the divine is by its very nature infinite, enclosed by no boundary. Hence, although God in himself is the really real, this reality cannot be communicated to us. This is truly the vision of God," says Gregory, "never to be satisfied in the desire to see him, but one must always, by looking at what he can see, rekindle his desire to see more." At this point, I'd like to just briefly return to the third question posed earlier. How is it possible for finite humans to embark on an infinite trip? Gregory's answer lies in his breakthrough to a new anthropology, particularly the way he interprets the Genesis account of human beings as made in the image and likeness of God. In his treatise on the creation of humanity, Gregory advances an original view of the nature of the image of God found in humankind. The Genesis text on creation in God's image was generally understood as placing the image in human intellectual nature, what the Greeks call nous, or else in human freedom, as Gregory himself often does. In the Creation of Humanity treatise, Gregory adds another dimension, saying that if the fundamental character of the divine nature is its incomprehensibility, then it follows that human nature shows its imitation of the archetype by also being unknowable. He puts it this way: because the nature of the soul evades our knowledge, it has an accurate resemblance to the superior nature of God, figuring by its own unknowableness the incomprehensible nature. The unknowableness of the human spirit, I argue, is the reason why it alone among created things is capable of undertaking the unending journey that is epectasis. The human soul does not know the infinite God, but it also does not even know itself as the image of the divine mystery. Therefore, it has the capacity, perhaps even the destiny, for epectasis. Now, not a minute too late, because I have only 2 minutes left, we come to Dionysius the Areopagite, the pseudonym of the unknown Syrian monk active shortly after 500, whose writings constitute the culmination of early Christian negative theology. It would be impossible to give a short account of the complexity, the fascination, the abiding mystery of these dense, spare texts that constitute the Dionysian corpus, about which so much has been written over the centuries. So I'm going to restrict myself to make 5 points, brief points, to bring this investigation to a close. First, Dionysius was a pioneer in using the term mystical theology. He also began speaking of the positive theology as cataphatic and negative theology as apophatic, although he took this terminology over from the Neoplatonist Proclus. What is clear from his writings is that both the positive and the negative theologies are necessary in the ascent to God, an ascent that is both liturgical and intellectual. Second point is that negative terminology and the purifying process that Dionysius calls stripping away, aphyresis, is superior to every positive operation. As he puts it in his treatise, The Mystical Theology, since the highest is the cause of all beings, we should posit and ascribe to it all the affirmations we make with regard to beings. And more appropriately, we should negate all those affirmations, since it surpasses all being. Therefore, Dionysius denies a merely logical view of affirmation and negation, such as we find in Aristotle. Rather, as he says, negations are not simply the opposite of affirmations. They're kind of supralogical or hypermetaphysical categories, indicating that the cause of all is considerably prior to this world, beyond privations, beyond every denial, beyond every assertion. So for Dionysius, God is utterly incomprehensible and ineffable, objectively and subjectively. Third, Dionysius insists that truly attaining God, as Moses did atop Sinai, is to go beyond both affirmation and negation. Negative theology is higher than affirmative theology, but it's not adequate. We never really talk about God. We only talk around God or near God, as he puts it in the 5th chapter of the Mystical Theology. It, the supreme principle God, it falls neither within the predicate of being or of non-being. Existing beings do not know it as it actually is, and it does not know them as they are. There is no speaking of it, no name nor knowledge of it. Darkness and light, error and truth, it is none of these. We make assertions and denials of what is next to it, or what stands by it. We could translate the Greek term anyway, but never assertions about it. So we gain God not by knowing, but by not knowing, a theme, as we've seen, Dionysius did not create, but which he developed beyond his predecessors. Fourth, what kind of speech, then, can we use in relation to God? Well, the operative word are the prepositions, Greek prepositions toward or into, epi and eis. That is, we cannot speak about God, but we recognize that we are allowed, even commanded, to speak to God or towards God. That is, to praise him, or better, to hymn him in the language of prayer, especially liturgical prayer. Nevertheless, and here in the fifth and final place, there are forms of language that can be used both in prayer and in theological speculation that rise above the interplay of affirmation and negation, aiming towards a higher realm beyond our comprehension. Some of these forms of language are abstract, especially what I call hyperlanguage and dialectical language. Other forms are symbolic, such as invoking cloud and darkness and expressions of erotic yearning. Dionysius' employment of the language of cloud and darkness, especially in his mystical theology in Letter 5, builds on the tradition going back to Philo and, of course, found in Clement and others. While not present across the whole Dionysian corpus, it was still central to the history of his reception as the 14th century English mystical classic, The Cloud of Unknowing, demonstrates. Now, many have said there's not much erotic language in the Dionysian corpus, and this is a half-truth, because it overlooks chapter 4 of the Divine Names and its analysis of the relation of divine and human eros. And I would argue, but not here, that this chapter expresses a Dionysian form of epectasis. But I want to close with a paragraph looking at what I call the speculative language that Dionysius uses in this attempt to aim towards God. So Dionysius was a speculative thinker, so his use of these abstract philosophical terms is important. Prominent in this regard is his employment of beyond language, hyperlanguage. For example, chapter 2 of the Divine Names says that those initiated in theological tradition, the PhD students, for example, assert that the invisible Trinity holds within a shared undifferentiated unity its hyper-essential subsistence, its hyper-divine divinity, its hyper-excellent goodness, its supremely individual identity beyond all it is, its oneness beyond the source of oneness, its ineffability, its many names, its unknowability. Dionysius' use of this hyper-language was to have a long history in mysticism. Equally important is how he uses what I call dialectical terms, that is, expressions which highlight the paradox of trying to say the unsayable God by joining together contradictories in the service of a higher synthesis. Among such forms of language, we can place the Dionysian use of infinite. He uses it some 30 times across his writings. And I will close with a passage, one of these 30 uses from the Divine Names, Book 5, Chapter 9, where he says, God is the boundary to all things and is the unbounded infinity about them in a fashion which rises above the contradiction between finite and infinite. He proceeds to everything while yet remaining within himself. He is at rest and astir, and is neither resting nor stirring, and has neither source nor middle nor end. He is nothing. He is no thing. This is where, for Dionysius, any pursuit of God, however stretched, necessarily ends, and it is where I will end as well. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you.
We have time for questions. There are microphones in both aisles, and also our students will bring them to you if you'd like. Please state your name and state your question as directly as possible. Thank you.
Yes, in the back.
I always find myself asking the first question, so I'll do it again. There are actually two questions here for you. One is totally technical, and that is when you use the word subsistence, what Greek word are you translating? The second question is a bigger one, and centers on Origenes, although it could deal with people before him as well. When you described some of his views, I began...
Who's the Origen now? We're doing?
Yeah, Origen. You call him Origen. Okay. I just, the word Buddhism came to my mind, including the planes of existence, and the whole question, therefore, of some Indian influence on the thinking of Christian and maybe even Philo and his predecessors, his Judaic predecessors, since he's the culmination of Jewish Greek philosophy, not the only guy. I'm just wondering whether you have any thoughts on this big problem.
Yeah, subsistence, I'm not sure. I don't have the Greek text in my notes here. Maybe hyparxis, but I'd have to go back and look. The question of the relationship of Christian mysticism and Plotinian mysticism to Buddhism and possibly even to forms of Hindu mysticism has been raised again and again because we know, according to the life of Plotinus by one of his students, Porphyry, he wanted to go to India because he had heard that there was a lot of good stuff going on in India, a lot of good philosophical thinking going on in India. And there were, as we know, trade connections. Don't forget, Plotinus was originally from Alexandria, wound up in Rome. But he never got there. Now, could he have had contact with Indian thinkers, possibly? It's certainly within the realm of possibility because of these trade contacts, but we don't really know. What we do know is that certain of the more apophatic mystics, such as Plotinus, and later on someone like Meister Eckhart, have often been seen as in some ways very, very close to certain aspects of Buddhism. And there are a number of Buddhist scholars who have written on Eckhart and who try to bring Eckhart and Zen Buddhism and other aspects closer together. Here it would not be connections, but it would be what I call comparative dynamics of systems, where thinkers wrestling with some of the deepest problems about the relationship of human to the divine come up with surprisingly comparable or similar, at least seemingly similar answers. And that's how I would try to answer that as a start, at least. Yeah. One over here, please.
How would the philosophers you've described have regarded Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel depiction of God?
I don't know. I guess would be the best answer that I have to that. I know how I regard it.
How do you regard it?
Well, I regard it as one, certainly one of the great works of art in Christian history, but I also regard it as an icon of sacred history. All of history is laid out in the two programs of Michelangelo. On the ceiling, we have the early history, the creation of the world and the creation of humanity, the formation then of the people of God on the side walls, where you have paintings not done by Michelangelo. And then later on, almost 30 years later on, he's asked to paint the Last Judgment, what will close off history. So one can study the entire program of the Sistine Chapel as an icon of salvation history, as well as, of course, such a magnificent work in itself. That's how I look at it. Yes?
Henry Thompson, how does it fit in with God's saying that we are created in his image? In other words, God has emotions, we have emotions. God has changed his mind a couple of times after Moses talked to him. I mean, how do we know when we were in sync with God and when we're not?
This is the question that so many of the mystics wrestle with. And of course, for many of them, beginning with, let's say, Irenaeus, the image is in the total humanity, body and soul, mind and heart. Beginning with thinkers like Origen and others who were much under the influence of Greek thought with this kind of separation of body and soul, the image tends to be more interiorized into human intellectual capacity, the mind, or else into human possibility of freedom. Gregory is the first who puts it primarily in the fact that the human as human is incomprehensible, just as God is. And every other created thing we can comprehend it, but there's something about humanity that is incomprehensible, and this is primarily what makes it the divine image. Now, they generally think about it in terms of this divisive anthropology between soul and body. I think we can take their insights back in an integral, holistic fashion and still use them. And some of the Christian fathers, like Irenaeus, certainly thought in that integral way. So that's the theoretical answer. How do we know that we are living that? That's the practical issue of if you will, Christian ethical teaching, but also Christian mystical teaching. Yes, here in the...
I think, too, about the Hinduism and Buddhism, because I love when you're talking about the apophatic thing, the Sanskrit neti.
Yeah.
I mean, it's perfect for that. But what it makes me think about is the incarnation. And as much as you're talking about the ability to describe or not describe the oneness of God, the incarnation doesn't seem to come up quite as often.
Yeah, the role of the incarnation. This is, I think, of course, one of the things that sets off Christian faith from other systems. Even though there's great similarities with regard to the apophatic dimension, Christianity, the cataphatic dimension, found in the fact that God has become man, sets up a different kind of dynamic, if you will. But it's not a dynamic that is necessarily totally different or apart from negative theology. A few years ago, it was back in the 90s, we had a conference in England. Oliver Davies and Dennis Turner and Rowan Williams, before he became Archbishop, on, and was published by Oxford. The title of the book is Negative Theology and Incarnation. And the papers in that conference were designed to say, how do we put these two things together, which I think is the brunt of your question. And there were different answers depending on different kinds of figures there, but you might take a look at that. There's a lot of stuff in it. Negative theology and incarnation. Yeah.
John Borelli. Did the use of Eros a la Song of Songs take a hit with Origen's reputation in the apophatic tradition and have to be recovered by others later on?
No, is the short answer to that, because it was also taken up by figures like Gregory of Nyssa, who of course was perfectly Orthodox. The Cappadocians are the great heroes of the Orthodox tradition. And it was taken up in the West by figures like Ambrose, not so much by Augustine. Augustine is very hesitant about human eros. But Ambrose and a whole succession of figures then in medieval period, the great commentators on the Song of Songs like Bernard of Clairvaux, William of Saint-Thierry, and a whole range of later figures. So Origen's condemnation did not affect what he was a pioneer in doing, which was to say, you know, the term used in the New Testament for love, agape, is really the same as the term eros in God. There's no real difference in them. We might think of them as different, but in God they're not. So is that, yeah.
Could you explain further the difference between soft apophaticism and hard? And how are you mapping the idea of infinity? Is infinity and language about infinity just a feature of the hard apophaticism?
Yeah, the difference, I mean, I use these terms soft and hard apophaticism. The term soft, by which I mean all Christian thinkers say God is ultimately incomprehensible. Not all. Eunomius thought, well, we can understand God. But he's an outlier very much, and of course a condemned neo-Arian. But most Christian thinkers, or almost all Christian thinkers, history has said, yes, of course, God lies beyond our knowing and the like, and then they go on to do all sorts of things. Hard apophaticism are those thinkers who sit down and say, what does it really mean to say that God is unknowable? And how then does our way of thinking and loving relate to that? And they create theoretical expositions of negative theology. And I think Clement of Alexandria is the first. It's certainly found very powerfully in Gregory of Nyssa, certainly found in Pseudo-Dionysius. It's found then later in the West in John Scotus Eriugena, in Meister Eckhart, in many late medieval theologians as well. These are variations on what I call hard apophaticism. Second part of your question, what I was trying to do here was to show that in Christianity, it seems to me that infinity is one of the terms they turn to in creating hard apophaticism. And the fact that we find it first in Clement, then it's not used in Origen because he's a soft apophaticist, but then it is used extensively in people like Gregory of Nyssa, in Dionysius. Originally thought of having this talk also include my friend John Scotus Eriugena, but I couldn't try your patience with more than just the early stages here. So that's how I put that in. I think, as far as I can see, infinity is one of the markers, one of the forms of language of the hard apophatic tradition. Okay.
Thank you.
Hi, Leo Lefebvre. Thank you very much, Bernie. This was
Yeah.
wonderful. I'd like to ask about the implications for human identity of realizing the incomprehensibility of God. In the mystical theology of Pseudo-Dionysius, it's one of my favorite passages. He describes Moses here being neither oneself nor someone else. What does it mean to be neither oneself nor someone else? And what new way of being in the world does this open up?
A very good question. I suppose I would answer it by quoting a line from Meister Eckhart. The eye with which I see God is the same eye with which God sees me. And if we're seeing from God's perspective, then you are neither the self nor another. This is the divine eye. That's the short answer. Is that helpful or not? Yeah. I mean, that's how I put that. I meditate on that phrase quite often and what it means and how powerful it is. I mean, from one perspective, you could say, oh my God, this is some kind of pantheism or terrible heresy, but I don't think it is. The eye with which I see God is the same eye with which God sees me.
Paul Heck, thank you very much. If I understood you correctly, at one point you mentioned one of these thinkers referred to God as nothing.
Oh, yeah.
Right. And that struck me as very interesting because the question of not knowing what we're worshiping. And I say that because in early Islam, there was a movement, the Jahmiyyah,
Yeah.
and occasionally they called people to stop praying because of this, it was, in their case, a very Neoplatonic outlook.
Yeah.
In fact, they used this very statement, God is nothing,
Yep.
no thing.
Yep.
And, of course, that provoked a reaction,
Yeah.
as you can imagine. But I'd just be curious if the idea is that God is no thing or unknown, that we're worshiping, how did that question, so the question of worship, was it just, okay, the incarnation, the Christian revelation that resolved that in the Christian case, or was it because they were starting from ritual, whereas maybe some of these early Muslim thinkers were starting more from a Neoplatonic framework? Or I'd just be curious if that question was raised at all and how they dealt with it. Thank you.
Yeah. The language of God as nothing or no thing is another one of the characteristics of what I'm calling hard apophaticism. So it's very powerful in Pseudo-Dionysius, in the Dionysian writings. Augustine would not use it. Thomas Aquinas will not use it. Thomas is an apophatic theologian. God is beyond everything that we can know, but Thomas Aquinas deliberately shies away from God as nothing. However, again, thinkers in the hard apophatic tradition, Meister Eckhart being a good example, his followers and people like Rusbrook, etc., will use that kind of language. I think most of them understand it in the way that Dionysius did. They all read Dionysius. This is kind of like the Magna Carta of Western mysticism. And Dionysius says, of course, God is no thing, and he changes on that different kind of language, but he feels that we are called to speak to God, we're called to worship God. And the Dionysian corpus is not, it's speculative, but it's not classroom theology. It's theology that's meant to be lived in a liturgical monastic community out there somewhere, probably in Syria. So it's helping them to say the liturgy that you are engaged in and your whole liturgical monastic life is indeed the only way that you can really speak toward God, because you really can't speak about God or say that you know God. So it's deeply liturgical. And even someone like Eckhart, I mean, his sermons, in which he advances this powerful apophatic theology, these are sermons preached in the churches of medieval Germany at the liturgical feasts and, scripturally based in the readings. There's a famous text from the book of Acts when Paul is struck down, remember, and the book of Acts says, Paul was raised from the ground and saw nothing. Meistercard says, great, great. I'm going to tell you 4 reasons why Paul saw no thing. Yeah. Yeah.
Hi, Leon Hooper. Thinking back so long ago when I read the first volume, Foundations, I recall maybe that you promised there that sometime in your 3rd volume or so that you would get around to Bernard Vonnegut.
Well, the 3rd volume, I got stuck in the 12th century.
I know. I know indeed. So I wondered if it's going to be in volume 7 or 8, and if you're going to be working through notions of analogy particularly.
I really do intend to, and I hope it will be in volume 7, because I'm getting older all the time, and this project can't go on forever. I've written a few papers in recent years, one of them called A Modest Proposal, Mystical Consciousness. It came out in Spiritus a few years ago, where I've tried to say a little bit more about what I'd like to expand on at a later stage in talking about contemporary theology of mysticism, in which I find Lonergan extremely helpful, but there are a number of other figures, obviously, that will enter into that, some aspects from Balthasar and Rahner, and things from Michel de Soto and other people. I've thought about some of this, and I've tried to express parts of it here and there. I would like to try to draw it all together. I thought that I could do it when it was only 3 volumes, but it's grown. Thank you for the question. Yeah.
Hi there.
Okay, yeah.
Sorry. Thank you. I was just wondering, how does the idea of God's being incomprehensible relate to the doctrine of the Trinity? In that, knowing that God is 3 persons, we know that God is in some way love, kind of this Augustinian idea of the lover, the beloved, and love itself, and kind of how that relates to him being incomprehensible, and also how it relates to the doctrine of creation and God's natural fecundity, as Meister Eckhart talks a lot about as well.
Well, God has told us in Revelation that he is Trinity. We really have no idea what that means. And the greatest theologians will always come down to that in the bottom line. But we know that God is Trinity, and we know that we praise God as Trinity. The beginning of the treatise Mystical Theology starts with a prayer, a hymn, in which God is addressed as hypertrias, beyond the Trinity, beyond the threefold, beyond being hyperousios, beyond goodness, hyperagathé, etc. So we use that language. Some of that language we know by reason about the highest principle. Other of that language have been given us in Revelation, but we don't know what it means. It tells us more maybe about ourselves, and we know we can use it adequately because it is part of Revelation. But if you think you know what the Trinity means, you're not in agreement with any good theologian in the history of Christianity. Thank you all. Thanks. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you. Thanks.
Please join us for a reception upstairs in the Galleria in the main hallway of this building, and we can continue the conversation there. Thank you very much for coming. Thanks again to the Costans and to the McGinns. Thank you.